A very good morning to one and all. We are just waiting for a few more audience to join. We'll just start in another 5 minutes. Thank you. Good morning to one and all present here. On behalf of Chandigarh College of Architecture, I, Neenal Mittal from Master's First Year, would like to welcome you all to a talk on the book Urbanism Beyond 2020 with the author, architect Vinayak Bharni. I would also like to welcome Professor Aarti from Department of Landscape, School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi, for today's talk session. Also, I welcome audience from Los Angeles and other parts of the world who are here to attend this talk today. And to deliver this talk, we welcome our guest speaker and author, architect Vinayak Bharne sir. I would request Principal Madam Dr. Sangeeta ma'am to please welcome our guest speaker for today.
Thank you, Meenal. A very good morning from Chandigarh, India, and a good evening to our friends from across the world. It's sheer delight to be able to host this talk today because from several months, Vinayak and I and Aarti have been having this conversation, and I'm also very happy to see Shyamji here. Good morning. And I think it's pure delight. And I'm so happy that finally Vinayak has had the opportunity and we've all come together today for this exploration, as I would like to call it, more than a talk. It's more an exploration, a discussion, and a melange of ideas that we are seeking forth through this research that Vinayak has put together. And I'm also very happy to congratulate Vinayak with a very good news this morning on my Facebook. There was a message. Vinayak is now professor at the UCL. And heartiest congratulations, Vinayak, for this wonderful, wonderful position. And with this, I would also like to mention that our core audience today is the master's program students, where Meenal is also one of the students from the class. This lecture has been put together, this talk has been convened by this class group of 20. And I can see them right there in their seminar studio waiting to listen to Vinayak, comments from Aarti, followed by Shyam too. Poonam Verma has sent her greetings and best wishes. She's not able to join, she's traveling. And there are many more whom we will introduce once the discussion moves further. And now, without any further delay, I would request Meenal to take forward the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I would take 2 minutes to introduce our guest speaker and author. Architect Bharne is a practicing urban designer and city planner based in Los Angeles, principal and director of design at Mole and Polyzoids Architects and urbanist in California, and professor adjunct associate of urbanism at University of South California, and India Netherlands-based knowledge platform My Livable City. His books include The Emerging Asian City, Affordable Housing, Zen Spaces and Neon Spaces, and Rediscovering Hindu Temple, the Sacred Architecture and Urbanism of India. He is also contributing author of several books such as Planning Los Angeles and Aesthetics of Sustainable Architecture, and also author of numerous articles published in JAE, Mark, Indian Express, Practicing Planner, etc. We are very eager and enthusiastic to hear you online today, sir. Thank you for considering our invitation. We really look forward to hearing you on your book today. Thank you.
Can I share my screen?
Yes, sir, sure.
It says I cannot. It says that I'm not allowed to. I think I need some permission or something.
Yes, sir. Now you can share.
Can you all see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Professor Bagga. Thank you to all of you for coming. It's a great honor to be at the Chandigarh College of Architecture. This is my first talk at your school. I certainly don't take it lightly. I also want to thank Aarti for joining us, agreeing to be the commentator, and of course, Shyam for coming all the way from the Netherlands, joining us today. I want to begin by telling you that Shyam is the culprit here because this book would have never come into existence if he had not encouraged me to do it. Shyam, as you know, is the founder of My Livable City. He brought me into My Livable City. And, you know, the earliest essays that I wrote on this book, he was the one who read them. And, you know, we all need a pat on our back once in a while from an accomplished individual to tell you that you're on the right path. So in my case, it was Shyam that said, Vinayak, you know, we have to publish this. And it was through his encouragement that I was inspired to do this. So very happy he's here. And if you don't mind, Sangeeta, I'd like to give Shyam the final word today, because I think he deserves it on this project at least. So a brief introduction to how this book came to be. When 2020 lockdowns began, many of us were invited to give talks. And the danger in giving talks frequently is that you're saying the same thing again and again. So you're compelled to organize your thoughts more carefully. And I realized that as some of us were doing this, in my case, a lot of notes had gathered that were notes on issues I consider important to me. So I felt that in the act of writing them down, you clarify for yourself what you're trying to say. And that's how these essays came to be. The second thing is I did not write these books for architects and planners alone. This book is written for everyone, because if there's anything I've learned in 25 years of practice, it is that architects and planners alone do not make cities, do not shape cities. We all shape cities. And so this is an effort to, open some of the things I consider crucial to city making in my conversations with so many friends. So this is also a tribute to all of them who have engaged with me in these conversations over the years. 2020 took us by surprise. We never had a year like this in recent history. Beginning on January 9th, there was an announcement by World Health Organization that a coronavirus-related pneumonia had started in the city of Wuhan in China. And if you think about it, within 12 months, we had lost 1.8 million people across the world. And this is just the recorded numbers. So there could have been more if you think about it. So the pandemic has hit us hard, made us think, and certainly brought to the forefront numerous issues that we were actually taking for granted. One of these issues for me was the issue of health, something quite fundamental and obvious, but I think an important one to discuss today. So the first chapter of the book is about health. And it begins by saying that the pandemic brought back the issue of health to our psychological forefront. It began to remind us that amidst all our preoccupations, fundamentally, we often forget that our profession, our allied fields of architecture, planning, urban design, conservation, in a way, are health-related fields. We are trying to create healthy cities. We are invested in the health of the city. And this is an important point for me because I've often been frustrated that we have reduced these fields to aesthetic fields. We judge architecture on style. We don't think about the impact it has too much on the social fabric of the city. It's become a kind of a thin field at times. And I think the pandemic shook us up in that regard. So I talk about numerous projects that revert this idea back. In the 1850s, for example, when Frederick Law Olmsted, many of you know the name, designed Central Park in Manhattan, this was a massive engineering effort. Thousands of tons of earth were taken away. Hundreds of thousands of trees were planted to create this built from scratch, massive space, completely man-made. Now, it was a massive engineering, impressive effort, but for Olmsted, it was not that. It was actually a public health project, because for him, he knew that as the city of New York and Manhattan was particularly exploding due to immigration and economic boom, if we hadn't had a space like this, the city would really be relatively unhealthy over the long term. And he was convinced that public space and open space was really the answer to this question. So he also knew that if he wanted to implement these massive public space projects, he couldn't do it purely as a landscape architect. So what he did is he left his position as the superintendent of Central Park and went on to head the United States Sanitation Commission and took on this lofty platform for where he could implement these massive, incredible projects in the 1800s and the early 1900s that we now know him for. And this issue of health is an important one, as this essay talks about, because we have gone through pandemics and epidemics before. And the plague in London, there's so many things that have ravaged humanity before, and they have taught us lessons again and again. There have been wake-up calls about what architecture and city planning ought to be, which is a health project, not just anything else, as a deep health project that is invested in the health of the city. But the fact is, we now know through scientific evidence that human health and environmental health are symbiotic. You cannot have human health if you don't have the ecological side completely balanced. And this is an important, timely, and urgent subject because deforestation is happening at an alarming rate. And we now have factual evidence to suggest that epidemics and pandemics are directly related to deforestation. For instance, the SARS epidemic that happened, the Ebola epidemic that happened, particularly the Ebola one that happened in Africa, happened in areas of heavy deforestation. So I've said this so many times in recent talks. There is now numerous research that suggests that forests, although they appear healthy from the air, may not actually be healthy. Because when you go deep into the forest and you do ecological studies, it may be that because some predator has died, the entire system is in imbalance. That's one. So everything that looks green on top doesn't have to be so. Second, a forest is a balanced ecology. You have birds, beasts, insects, viruses, bacteria, and they're all living in harmony. That's the way nature made them. We were never supposed to engage with these. Humans are not made to engage with deep forests. But when we do, through urbanization, and forests get destroyed, what happens is because the habitats of these creatures is destroyed, they come into contact with humans, we get into contact with them, viruses start exchanging, and they mutate. So we now know that the AIDS virus, for example, jumps from a chimpanzee into a human and mutated into the immunodeficiency virus that we now call AIDS, because the chimpanzee had been hunted by these people. So what you see in these diagrams and in this essay is a reminder that however inapplicable it may seem to metropolitan environments, it's just a reminder that there were times, and there are times even today in certain areas, where indigenous practices can teach us numerous lessons about sustainability and sort of renewal. For instance, the Korowai tribe in Papua New Guinea is a unique pattern of development. What they do is they live in tree houses that are very high up on a tree, and that's because they want to protect themselves from the forest. So they have a millennial tradition where trees are built 50, 60 feet in the air, and they're experts at building these trees. So the animals are kept on the ground, the humans live on top, and they live in these large houses way up above the forest cover for about 12 years. And every 12 to 15 years, they renovate the house, but after 12 to 15 years, instead of staying there, they come down, they take another part of the forest, and they build a new house there and let the old one, which you see in the last slide below, they let the old one just renew itself, because they know that if you stay in a forest in any one area for a long time, you've disturbed the carbon footprint, you've disturbed the ecological footprint. So the constant nomadic idea of the Korowai is not just a way of seeking new pastures for themselves, but also about letting nature replenish itself. And I think this was an important wake-up call, because when the lockdowns began, we heard so many things, like for the first time, forests began to heal themselves. There was news that areas that humans had just kept devastating were now having time to sort of replenish. And that was a reminder to us of the insurmountable damage that we continue to do on our ecologies, which reminds you that cities are not for humans alone. As architects, we cannot think of cities as human-centric entities. Cities are multi-species ecologies. And the question this essay asks is, what are the best practices that we see in numerous progressive nations? I mean, Netherlands is at the forefront of it. Canada has some great examples where highways, viaducts, infrastructure like freeways, which usually just ravage ecosystems, are now done in sensitive ways, where the freeway is taken at a lower level. You have entire, viaducts that are natural, that allow for corridor crossings, etc. But the key point this essay makes is, while all this is wonderful and is very progressive, what these countries have really done is they've monitored these pieces of infrastructure. They haven't just built them. It's easy to say, I built something and now I hope for the best. What they've done is they've invested money to monitor the biological behavior of the creatures. And so there's empirical evidence to suggest now what a long time it takes for grizzly bears and foxes and all these deers and etc. to actually adapt as they take into account these new systems that they have to now navigate to cross human habitats. So the point this essay makes is that when you talk about environmental stewardship in this world, we as architects, urban designers, planners are at the forefront of it. If you think about it, we cannot leave environmental sustainability, environmental conservation to the biologists alone. They're doing it in one way, which is to conserve biological resources. But there's another side to the environmental equation, which is really about changing the dogmas of city making, changing how we make cities, changing how we think of architecture. And if this doesn't happen on both sides, then it's a one-sided equation. We're destroying nature by making cities and we're leaving conservation to them. That's not the way to think about it. So if you want to position yourself, you are an environmentalist. If you're an architect, if you're a planner, you are an environmentalist. If you just shift your perspective to thinking that you are. But when you talk about it from a social perspective, the fact is that the cities we've created so far are completely unjust. If you think about it from a majority world perspective, not just the affluent countries, we live in grossly unjust cities. I mean, during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, we know, we've seen it in India, the inhuman migration that happened because people who had no choice but to earn their wage through daily errands, the lack of employment, had now returned to their villages. I mean, it was a very touching scene. So the slide you see on the top here is just a reminder that there are thousands, millions of people across the world who don't have proper shelter, who don't have access to fundamental infrastructure, who earn their wages by going into environments that you and I never want to hang out in. And it's a double-edged sword because they don't have access to healthcare, and these places make them more vulnerable to disease. So this chapter talks about progressive efforts that have happened in less affluent societies, where it's not about having money and doing great planning, but how do you solve desperate situations? And I'll show you two that I talk about. One is in Medellin, you know this probably, in Colombia, where they've taken the most difficult areas of the city, the comunas, which is the squatters in the hills, and to accord them better access into the employment areas, they've created these cable cars. And then, of course, the world-famous bus rapid transit system in Curitiba in Brazil, which was done by Jaime Lerner, a fantastic architect and planner who, because they didn't have enough money to do trains, created this progressive strategy of expanding the city through corridors. And in the middle of the corridor, you have bus rapid transit systems, which now take 85% of the population and make it accessible to transit. So there are numerous examples where public transit of various kinds, for instance, done in strategic ways, and you can read about this in the book, has made itself available to a diversity of demographic. And whether you're wealthy or whether you're not wealthy, you now have other choices through which you bridge inequalities by giving everyone the same rights to the city. So it's not like the privilege of transit is only for a few, it's for everyone, and these are examples where it's happening. Informality came to the forefront big time. During the pandemic, the informal economy, because it collapsed, right? I mean, vendors began to struggle because there was no foot traffic. So we began to realize that the colossal sort of matrix of the city that sustains so many of our cities every day is so important for us. And the pandemic exacerbated these gaps, the divides between the have and the have-nots. So this is an essay that gets into a study that I've been doing for almost 20 years. This is part of my book on temples, where you realize that because our cities don't have the adequate structure to accommodate a range of demographics, these demographics have to find ways of claiming the city for themselves, and they do it in incredibly beautiful ways. My research is mainly focused on the intersection of religion and urbanism. So in the absence of built form, what many of these people do is they claim the space under the trees, just as they do in the village. And one of the most millennial patterns of Indian urbanism, I've always maintained, is this beautiful phenomenon of venerating a tree. So the tree becomes worshipped, as we all know, and begins to spawn a rudimentary temple, and the temple becomes a shack. And the shack becomes a small little shrine. You can see that the tree is growing. And finally, at the bottom, the tree is died. The tree dies, but the spot remains sacred and becomes a temple, a franchise temple, perhaps with ownership, which now begins to attract urbanity around it. The main point here is that this is not a tradition alone. This is an active, contemporary pattern of urbanism that's happening in our cities every day. And some of India's largest temples have happened this way. So the key point of this essay is to highlight that formal planning, all the kind of formal planning that we're taught and that happens through Indian cities, doesn't yet know how to engage with these forces. And neither do we bring them into the dialogue. The magic survives, of course, because it's resilient. But formal planning has not found a way to bridge itself with these kind of important millennial forces that are not going to go away. So these kind of forces manifest in everyone's lives through festivals. And one of the great observations to make during the pandemic was how, in the wake of danger to your own life, when you were told not to go out, did these patterns continue to prevail? I mean, this was an incredible fascination, right? I mean, think about it. Holi was celebrated. The Gyo-matsuri parade, one of Japan's biggest festivals that you see on the right-hand side, was canceled because Japan completely closed its doors. But in Goa, where I am from, there's a magical phenomenon that happens every Diwali, which is they build these narkasurs, which is these paper mache effigies of demons that they burn at dawn every day. And they continued during the pandemic. You can see the process of them getting built. And the point of this essay is to highlight the notion that, that the informal management of our cities, the sort of silent tolerance that happens, many of these demon effigies are just brought up during Diwali, and each neighborhood is marked by one of them. Now, from a theoretical perspective, this is illegal because you are encroaching into the public domain, like the Wayside Shrine. They're all illegal entities. But it's an accepted idea. As people just claim the city, they do what they have to do, and the next morning everything is burned down and the city returns back to normal. So this kind of malleability, this magical malleability that we found in cities in the global south, have a lot to teach affluent countries of the north, where things are overly managed, overly regulated, and they're craving these kind of aspects. But the fact is that cities across the world are different. And why are they different? They're different not because they look different. I mean, that's a shallow way of thinking about it. The real profound reason they're truly different is because they're governed differently. So the visible aspect of a city is shaped by the invisible forces that are behind it. And if you think about it, something as simple as participatory planning, a very important word that has almost become a cliche now, right? We all want to do participatory planning. What exactly does that mean? I mean, this is a unique democratic privilege in certain societies. Certainly in the United States, this is a huge privilege in formal planning. So the project that you see at the bottom here is a project I've been involved in where at the scale of an entire city, not just a neighborhood, at an entire city, you can actually, through a transparent democratic process, talk to all the stakeholders, the communities, the council members, engineers, multidisciplinary people, and you can project through data what kind of housing, what kind of uses are going to be projected through market studies over the next 30, 40, 50 years. And you can actually concentrate these kind of built entities in certain locations. You can prepare corridors to take more development. You can create a new downtown. And all this can happen through planned means, through regulation. So policy is a very powerful instrument in certain nations like the US to forge planning on a very large scale. But it cannot solve the problems that you see on the top, right? Because the formal planning doesn't have the means to engage with desperate extreme urbanism. So what this essay really talks about is that formal planning can only go so far, and that true governance, particularly in the pandemic and particularly in countries like Africa and the global south, have proven to us that there are other entities that need to be amalgamated with formal planning instruments to be more effective, because formal planning cannot reach certain aspects of the city which are far more difficult to navigate. It cannot solve the issues of demographics of a certain kind, which entities like humanitarian organizations, non-profit entities are crucial, and they're brilliant at solving them. So this essay calls for a kind of an amalgamation between these entities. Instead of thinking of a top-down approach where you have planning and then everything else, it calls for a diffused approach where different entities are now creating a model of planning subjects that are catering to different issues, because our cities are complex mechanisms. Public space. I think this is a huge subject that has emerged. I mean, public space was always important. I mean, if you ask any sensible urbanist, they'll tell you that the answer is not in the buildings, it's in the space between the buildings. But the pandemic highlighted this in a big way, because we now know that the coronavirus is spread through droplets and aerosols, right, through the air. So a hospital or an enclosed grocery store has a greater chance of spreading the coronavirus than an open park. If you have hundreds of people in an open park, the chances of catching the coronavirus are less. But if you're in a hospital, in a closed grocery store, there are more. So this begins to suggest that it is the entire network of public spaces, our streets, plazas, parks, courtyards, terraces, barsatis, all of these things that will create the malleability and the resilience that we need during this pandemic. So it's sort of inverted the equation and brought to the forefront the need for public space design. But the fact is that public space and its relationship with cities is different. So I'm highlighting the stats that the book calls out. Mumbai has 1.1 square meters of public space per person. London has 31.68. So different cities have different expectations of how the behavior of people in public space happens. This is a project that I was involved in about 10 years ago, where we took a mile-long street in California. And from scratch, through urban design, you work with the city officials to plant more than 1,000 trees, and you completely transform the street. And what it does is 2 or 3 things. One, it creates an iconic center for the city where the rich and the poor, the wealthy and the less wealthy, can come and claim this as an important space that they can come at will. So it's a wonderful experiment of social resilience that that space is open to everyone. So that's the beauty of open space. But the second important lesson we learned is because this space became so iconic, developers from neighboring cities and from the city now wanted to build buildings, build affordable housing on that street. The land prices go up, and this place begins to become more lucrative. And this is another way of generating economic resilience. So where I'm going with this is that investment in public space is not some kind of ethical luxury or ethical principle. Of course it is. But the fact is, it's a brilliant economic development strategy. You can make your city more prosperous because people now live a better life. Land prices go up, better shops want to come, more commerce wants to come in. This is the power of urban design. Design matters, and we can use it to generate economic prosperity in our cities for everyone. When it comes to architecture, one strange thing happened during the pandemic, which is that the high-rise, one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements, came into serious scrutiny. So think about it. New York, along with Wuhan and Milan, were among the most, the COVID-19 pandemic hit these 3 cities the hardest. And they all had one thing in common. They were high-rise, high-density cities. There was a lot of density, high-rise, and particularly New York, which sort of pioneered this, right? So the high-rise came into question for a number of reasons. People in the lockdowns in 2020, there was a lot of news about how people were a little afraid to live in high-rises. They were sort of quietly going out from high-rises. It happened in New York, particularly people were escaping to the outskirts because there was this concern that in a high-rise, where you're going 40, 50 floors above the ground, you don't have the luxury of opening your windows anymore. You're living in an airtight container. You're conditioned completely, which means that your air is being circulated. You're breathing somebody else's air, which increases your chances of catching the coronavirus. You got to get into an elevator and come down 40 floors. What if somebody has touched it? So there was a lot of concern because we didn't know enough about the virus as we know now. The vaccine hadn't been there. So there was a lot of sort of psychological upheaval about it. And the high rise came into question. And so this essay sort of picks on that and says, if you think of the high rise and the evolution of the high rise, there are numerous models we can think about. There is the New York high rises. Then there is Corbusier's high rise. You can see these 24 cruciform towers where, you completely cut yourself off from streets or anything, and you just have huge swaths of space between them. The principal argument this essay makes is that while in cities where land is scarce, and there are those cities like Hong Kong, like Tokyo, where land is extremely scarce for geographic reasons, for many other reasons, high-rises may be the only option to go. I mean, Hong Kong is a high-rise city for a particular reason. It doesn't have a choice. But in other cities where you do have land, and certainly in India, some of the best architects of the last generation have said this to us again and again, that the answer is not necessarily always in high-rise density. It's not in high-rise high density. It is in low-rise high density. And there are 2 ways of achieving it. The diagrams to the top show you that you can amalgamate high-rises with mid-rises and low-rises. So, on the scale of a block or on the scale of a site, you don't just have to plunk a high-rise in the middle of it. You can make a street urbanism by taking high rises, putting mid rises and then low rises and placing them next to each other to make some streets that are low, some streets that are mid, some streets that are high. This is the lesson of Manhattan. And the one to the bottom is a competition we won in California because we were the entry that basically said, instead of putting 6, 10, 15, 20-story towers, you can get the same density of about 200 dwelling units to the acre by going 5 floors, 4 floors, and 3 floors. This is the lesson of Barcelona. This is the lesson of mid-rise cities, where if you arrange density around courtyard, you can get enormous intensity. So low-rise, high density, as said by numerous architects in the global south, is really the answer that I think the pandemic brought to the forefront as well. Polycentric cities. In the lockdowns, we didn't want to go too far from our homes. We were concerned. I don't want to go to the grocery store to shop. What if I catch the coronavirus? So I order online. We think about it. What this really meant is if our shops were available to us right there, in walking distance, I wouldn't have to sit in a car. There was a time before the pre-industrial era where all cities were polycentric. Polycentric means that every city has numerous centers and everything that you need in your daily life is available within walking distance. If you ask your grandparents or great-grandparents, that's how we all lived in every part of the world, primarily because we didn't have high-speed cars or anything. So there was no choice. You had to walk everywhere. So the baker came to your house, the fresh fish came to your house. Even today it happens in Goa, and we don't think too highly about it, but it's a beautiful thing. So what this essay calls out is the model, the planning model, where Clarence Perry in 1929 in the United States proposed an idea that neighborhoods should be created on what he called a quarter-mile shed. In Indian terms, it would be 400-meter radius. And the idea was that a 400-meter walk is a 5-minute walk that anybody can do. It's easy. You won't walk more than 5 minutes, but you certainly can walk 5 minutes. So if you make a neighborhood, 800 meters in diameter or 400 meters in radius, and you put all your amenities in the middle, then everyone can walk to them within 5 minutes. That was the idea. What he did, which we now know was not a very good idea, is he placed the school in the middle of the neighborhood. And that was not a very good idea because as the generation passes, the people who live in that neighborhood don't go to that school anymore, and the school kind of attracts people from outside. So in 1994, another generation of American town planners, what they did is they reversed this. They took the school outside. They took the highways around the neighborhood, took them away. They put retail and other uses in the middle. And then in around 2007, this entire model took on a sustainability agenda of water swales and water harvesting that you see in the green. The point is, this model, which we call the pedestrian shed, went all across the world. You can find it in Jaipur. You can find it in Israel. It happened in wonderful ways. It also showed its drawbacks because what happened is because all the amenities were placed on the inside now, it began to get insular and began to ignore the outside. But nonetheless, this is a model that has prevailed progressively in the Western world. The point this essay makes is that cities in the global south are already polycentric, as many of you know. You're living there. We have, look at your areas in Chandigarh. Look at all the vendors that, beautifully have this entrepreneurship where they find themselves at the fringe of your neighborhoods. And as a result, you probably have everything you need in a sector. You just walk out and you find them at the edges and everything is largely available. But formal planning does not account for them. So there's this incredible tension between these forces that create the way things ought to be, but we don't know how to accommodate them. So how do you shape polycentric cities when these entities are already there? Retail came into the limelight in a big way, and enclosed grocery stores and enclosed mega malls suddenly became unappealing because we didn't want to go into them anymore. And this highlighted the notion that you can now, what has been going on for 20, 30 years in the European and American world is we've been fighting against malls. So you can see this mega mall with a gigantic parking lot around it, and a project that we've done where we take the same site and we show through urban design how you can create a master plan where the enormous area, this land that is given to cars, can now be given to blocks and streets and courtyards with parking concentrated in certain areas. So you can begin to create mixed-use environments where it's all about people and all about public space and cleaner air rather than utopian landscapes. So this essay uses Los Angeles as the utopian city that changed the paradigm of retail from walking to cars and how it is now reversing this and how the pandemic is highlighting the importance of this rehearsal. We then come to vernacular infrastructure, something all of you know very well. I want to remind you that before the pandemic began, there was another crisis going on in the world. It's still going on, which is the water crisis. More than 1 billion people across the planet do not have access to clean water. So yeah, we think highly of the pandemic affecting us, but these people have been affected for a very, very long time. So the argument of this essay is that while the pandemic has this consistent theme of the coronavirus that unifies us all, that we're all affected by the coronavirus, the guises of the water crisis are very different. In arid climates, the water crisis is about water scarcity, where you don't have the availability of water. In tropical climates, in monsoon climates, it's about water abundance. You have flooding, you have malaria, and you have the lack of distribution, because in these countries, there isn't enough infrastructure. Even the water is available, but there isn't enough infrastructure to carry the water to the people who are the most underprivileged. So because we now know through studies that our metropolitan infrastructure in sort of less affluent nations simply cannot cater to the underprivileged demographic, the answer might very well lie in reviving and reinventing vernacular systems that are already in existence. I mean, you have the WAVs, you have the step dwells, you have the Kanats. I mean, all these exist in our cities. The essay talks about the Hitti system of Nepal, the Kanat system of Iran, the step dwells of India. All of these are looked at by architects as artifacts to be fetishized. I mean, we love them, we document them. What is not talked about is how to bring them back for social impact, to talk about the people that really need them the most. One of the most fascinating subjects that happened during the lockdowns and the pandemic was when we were all told to stay indoors because there was a threat to our life. A lot of protests happened across the world. I mean, think about it. This is the Shaheen Bagh protest that was going on in Delhi right when the pandemic began. And then, the police had to sort of take them away. And there were numerous such events, that were sort of going against the, it was, protests are a way of shouting against perceived institutional underperformance, right? And so people come out in droves, and it's not like they were violating rules. They were carrying masks, they were doing everything, but they were protesting. They were hurt somewhere, and whatever it was. The point of this essay is to remind you that from an architectural perspective, the places in which protests happen have so much to teach us. And this essay takes the example of Delhi and talks about 2 or 3 important monuments, certainly Jantar Mantar, which, as you know, for the last 50, 60 years, its identity has really been about protests, not about astronomical instruments, because most of the protests in Delhi happen around there. And then India Gate, where ironically, I don't know if you know this, but in November 2019, around 1,500 people had gathered at India Gate protesting against the pollution in Delhi. And then, when the lockdowns began, the government, was not able to do much, but because the lockdowns happened, all these cars were taken away from the street, and all of a sudden the air became clean, and the pandemic sort of created this magical response to their protest. So you must have seen on BBC, there was a beautiful image of India Gate where half of it was shrouded in the fog of the pollution and the other half was incredibly clean. And for the first time, Delhi residents said they could see the stars, and they claimed how the city was completely different. So this talks about the landscape of protest to remind you that monuments in our cities cannot simply be thought of from their originating histories, but from the evolving identities that happen through constant processes of flux that is so much part of our city making. Art. Art flourished during the pandemic because artists found a way of bringing smiles to our faces when we were depressed. There was so many incredible art projects happening all over the world. That little round coronavirus you see there was actually created by one of my neighbors in my neighborhood on Halloween. And so I went there and took a picture of it and published it in my book because I thought it was, people were just finding ways of expressing themselves. And it reminds you that at the end of the day, the greatest role art plays in our cities is to enhance civic pride. I mean, art has a way of doing things that nothing else can. So this this incredible project that you know by the Dutch artists Haas and Hahn in the Santa Marta favela in Rio de Janeiro, where they went years ago and they took 70 houses and they painted it. It was just simple paint used to just create some creative art piece on the walls. And the result was it became such an iconic thing that it first brought a renaissance into the lives of the residents, and then tourists began to come. And as a result, the economy boomed, and the favela is now a completely changed place. So simple artistic endeavors of so many kinds that the chapter talks about are ongoing and that are allowing people across the world to connect in these times of distress. Technology, we now underestimate the times we live in, and I've certainly lived in a time before the internet, but we live in a time when manifold travel has completely changed everything. I mean, on the one hand, something as simple and fundamental as food has changed. I mean, think about this photograph. This is the Tsukiji market in Tokyo, where thousands of tons of fish are used to get cut every day and then shipped across the world to create a phenomenon called sushi. And obviously, when global demand collapsed, what happened is this market all of a sudden trembled because it was supposed to move to a new facility and now it didn't know what to do. But the key point that this, so this essay traces the evolutionary trajectory of technology, beginning with the aqueducts in Rome, down to the release of the IBM computer and everything we today have. But the key point of this is to remind us that at the end of the day, technology will only go as far as its availability to the demographic. So if you read what I've written there, if you read the National Statistical Office report of the government of India from June 2018, only 24% of Indian households have internet access, and only 11% possess any kind of computer. So although online classes were good, the question is we have a long way to go. And the essay also talks about how there are numerous innovative ideas now to bring access, internet access to people in remote areas that are very difficult to access. How are people making this possible through creative ways like balloons, etc.? And then some personal sort of essays that I wrote them as things were happening all around me. You could see every day photographs of Taj Mahal completely empty, photographs of St. Mark's Piazza in Venice, some of the most iconic places in the world, completely empty. And it was as if someone perverse had used Photoshop and taken all the people out. That was what we saw during the lockdowns. And what this essay argues is that it's something I've often chuckled about. I remember, it's like architects particularly. I've seen this when I was a young student in India, and I would read these books, and I would open these books. And I remember Chandigarh, talking about Chandigarh, Sangeeta has heard me say this. I used to look at these photographs of Corbusier's buildings, which never had any people in them. They were just Corbusier's buildings from the 1950s, as if people didn't matter. And they were written by incredible architects. And that's how I studied, Chandigarh's incredible architecture. And when I went to Chandigarh, I saw something completely different. So this essay is called The Edited City, because it just reminds you that we have this terrible habit as architects to be so obsessive about our buildings that we forget the reality that surrounds them. So years ago, I was walking up with a very well-known Japanese architect friend, and we walked by the famous Yoyogi Stadium, designed by Kenzo Tange. You can see that building in the photograph at the top left. 1960, I think he designed it. And there was a farmer's market in front of it. And my eminent friend pulled out his camera in excitement, and he was about to take a photograph, and then turned to me and said, "Vinayak, damn it, I can't get a photograph because the farmer's market is blocking my view." And I found it very amusing. I didn't say it to him because I thought it would offend him, but I found the bare photograph of the concrete building utterly boring. I thought the farmer's market in front of it was incredibly beautiful. So same thing with Taj Mahal. This is a photograph I took, I think about 5-6 years ago now, where at dawn, the riverbed of the Yamuna that once went all the way to the base of the Taj Mahal's red sandstone plinth is now dry, and the villagers are now using it as a cricket field. So, what do you choose to see in the city? That's the question this essay asks, and it uses the kind of perverse scene of the empty streets that we saw during the lockdown as a way of reminding ourselves that these photographs are as unnatural as the ones that architects choose to show without any people in them. The last few essays go into cities that I have visited, that I know well, and that provoke reactions in me because of incredible stuff that they have done. Shanghai is one of them. This essay talks about the uniqueness of the Shanghai Bund, the history of the Bund, which is one of the most iconic public spaces anywhere in the world, because on the western bank, you have these beautiful colonial buildings that you see on one side, and on the eastern bank, you have a completely neo-modern, sort of sort of skyline, which is almost schizophrenic to look at. But that's not the point. The point is, while we may like or not like what we see here, a lot of people miss the fact that in a massively exploding, growing city like Shanghai, the price to conserve buildings is incredibly high. And this should be a lesson for any Asian city, because the amount that Shanghai has conserved remains often underestimated. So the essay kind of shifts the rubric and talks about conservation, because all of these colonial buildings, thousands of square feet of stone facades, 144 historic streets. I mean, the list is enormous. So while we may criticize or not like or like what we see in these modern skylines, you must understand that this is also a city that has invested heavily because it understands that its past has a lot of value as well. And the second thing this essay highlights is the methods of resilience that these cities teach us. Shanghai, for example, when I think it was April 2021 or April, it was April, around May or something, 2020, the lockdown was lifted. And what Shanghai did is it proposed a massive project to expand the Bund to the north. So, and I believe the project is still going on. So it was almost like rebounding the economy. It actually brought in an even more ambitious project as a way of generating optimism and generating economic boom again, as a way of generating resilience towards the kind of perceived shock that we had all felt during the early 2020s. Tokyo is a city I know very well. I've lived there. I've written about it. It is a city I return to again and again in my life to just remind me how much I don't know about cities, because Tokyo contradicts everything that is commonly held, sort of common sense, when you talk about cities. And the reason is, a lot of us go to Tokyo, we look at Tokyo like this, and we make an impression about it, and we say it's unplanned, it's too dense. Tokyo is the densest city on the planet, by the way. But what we don't realize is that Tokyo has gone through more disasters than any other city on the planet. So if you look at the mappings of how Tokyo grew, you can see from the left, it grows in the 1600s as a castle town. Then it shatters because there is a tsunami or an earthquake. Then it's built again. Then it grows and it shatters again. And then it's built again, it shatters again. Almost anywhere from 100 to 150 earthquakes and tremors happen in Japan every year. So the question this essay is asking is, how would you live in a city that will be destroyed from time to time? What would you do? What kind of disaster preparedness would you be ready for? That's what this essay highlights, a subject that's very important from the pandemic. And then the last three essays talk about, one goes to Benares, another city that I have returned to again and again. I've been studying Benares for 20 years. It is a city I'll probably keep studying for the rest of my life, because this is a city that has so much in it that challenges everything we hold conventional. If Tokyo represents a city at the extremes, Benares represents the city as an anachronism. If you go to Benares, I remember many of my students saying to me, it feels like you're being transported to the 9th century or something when you see things like this, according to them. But the fact is, these are contemporary realities that we must acknowledge as part of anything else, right? So the key point here is that if you look at mappings of Benares that are done by different users, the mappings are entirely different. You have the second one from the left is done by an architect from Google Earth. The one to the left is done by a hermit who sees Benares as a cosmic diagram. For him, the morphology of the city is irrelevant. The third one is done by an artist who takes the Nandi bull, which is the vehicle of Shiva, and inscribes the temples on the body of the bull. It goes on and on. Every day at 7:30, you have the Ganga Puja, where the river Ganga, which is the sort of genius loci of the reason why the city exists, is made into a deity, and monks come out and worship the river, went into an elaborate choreographed ritual, and so many scholars have studied this. The important point is, during the pandemic and the lockdowns particularly, something incredible happened. The Ganga River is one of the most polluted rivers, as you know, on the planet. But for the first time, because there was no activity, people could actually look through the river and see the ground. There was a lot of news about how hermits were entirely happy that finally what so many ministers and so many coalitions could not do in decades, the pandemic had done in 1 minute. And the second thing is the resilience of this city. Because people were not allowed to go out, we thought the Ganga Puja would stop. But I want you to know that it continued every day. The only difference was there was no one to watch the choreographed spectacle, but one monk, only one monk would go out, stand at the Ganga and do the worship. But it continued every day. It reminds you what sacredness means to cities like this. And then the last essay takes you into the world of practice and makes the point that at the end of the day, for all the readings we may do of the city, it is about action and it is about changing. It is about engaging with the forces that shape the city, and makes the argument that when you begin to enter the world of action, you begin to realize that architects, urban designers, planners, all of us who are purveyors of the built environment have very little power on the chess game of city making. We are what I call pawns, but a pawn has its place. Now, if a pawn behaved like a king or a queen or a bishop, I think all hell would break loose. But if that pawn realized that it's a pawn and it has its place on the chessboard, and if it forms alliances with all the people that have more power than what it has, I think there's a greater chance of having a checkmate. So the book really ends on the note that while we read cities differently, we engage with cities differently, and cities themselves are different, and there are many methods of changing cities, the fact is we must understand at the end of the day that perhaps the best way of thinking of post-pandemic urbanism, whatever that means, if at all there is such a thing, is to stop thinking of super specializations, stop thinking of ourselves as the people that will make the only difference in the world, and start thinking of alliances with all the other entities that have already brought incredible change during a crisis like this. They have helped more people than we could. They have created more impact than we could. They have created methods of influence much more than our professions could. If we could learn from them and form alliances like pawns could do on a chess game, our chances of making a healthier world and a better world are much greater. And that's where the book really ends. And now I'll turn it on to Aarti to make some sense out of this book, Aarti, in a way that only you can. Thank you all for listening, and over to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an interactive session. Now I would like to invite Professor Aarti from Department of Landscape, SPA Delhi, for her valuable comments. And also I would request audience to raise their questions in the chat box below. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bagga and Team CCA for having me here to present my views about Urbanism Beyond 2020. As mentioned, the book looks at our cities in the wake of pandemic from various epistemological lenses, starting from, it has 20 chapters, very, very pertinent aspects, starting from ecology to morphology, health, to art, informal economies to vernacular infrastructure, governance to places for protest, and many more. Professor Vinayak Bharne is an extremely respected professional in the field of urban design and city planning for more than 2 decades now, because of his practice and scholarship. And hence, I see this book also as a part of Vinayak's continuing advocacy for an ecologically conscious and socially inclusive urban future. I've had the pleasure of reading the book and reviewing it too, and the review has been published in the latest issue of Journal of IIA, March 2022, for anyone who wants to go through my detailed comments on it. But today, what I'm going to do is 2 things. One, to very briefly comment on what the book has to offer to its readers, which has been very, very efficiently already been done by the author himself. But 2, and more importantly, elaborate on how urbanism is being reimagined in our part of the world, especially through the same anchor points as Vinayak has chosen to write upon. So here is my take on the book. health, ecology, vernacular systems, open space paradigms, informality, justice, governance, and many, many more very pertinent aspects have been touched upon, making it a very wide spectrum, which itself, in my opinion, is an incredible endeavor. And I completely congratulate Vinayak on doing that under one roof. Each chapter discusses one specific idea in just 1,500 words, so to say, but those small essays, believe me, are powerful and provoking. There is a research-based narrative backed by examples and ideas from around the world. Now, the book does two very, very vital things here. One, it initiates the discourse on almost all pertinent facets of cities, provoking the reader through an undeniable argument along with examples from around the world, proving each time how urban systems and processes are inextricably connected to the outcomes, good and bad both, including this pandemic that we are facing today. And two, the book efficiently brings to the forefront that city making can not continue to be viewed as just a planning exercise anymore. It's not merely a number crunching game with some spatial rules coming in here and there, some open spaces, urban art, and we are good to go. Rather, it is a much more complex process and exercise than this. In this contemporary time of climate change, harsh urban realities like pollution, floods, and now disasters like pandemic, and many more haunting uncertainties which may be just around the corner, city planning has to be and must be understood as a health and wellness project. Vinayak very aptly starts by talking about some pressing concerns of health, forest, wildlife, and later also includes water systems in crisis and open space paradigms. Being trained as a landscape architect and being located at SPA, these aspects to me are for sure the most crucial towards making a functional and healthy city. They are the prerequisites of what we call ecological urbanism, where ecology inspires urbanism that is most socially inclusive and sensitive to the environment. If we see the trend world over today, our natural ecosystems are under a serious threat and are deteriorating at an alarming rate. Forests are disappearing, leading to habitat loss, and many species, hence, under a serious threat of extinction. One of the major reasons for this, of course, is exponential rise in the human populations and the expansive urbanization required to take care of these increasing numbers, especially in the developing countries like ours. World data on biodiversity, on forest, on natural habitats is depressing. We know that. So chapter 2 and 3 of the book, The Forest and the City and the Wild City, display a phenomenal sensitivity of the author where he explains how ecology and the environment should become the basis of any spatial decision making. In India, at the beginning of the 20th century, about 30% of the total land occupied by the forest, which by the end of the century has declined to 19.44%. This is the data which we have formally on the records. And interestingly, by applying a lot of stringent rules now, we are moving towards a positive direction. What we are witnessing now is that the country has been successful in reclaiming 23.58% of land area under forest cover by 2021. And the credit goes to these legislative and regulatory policies like National Conservation Strategy, National Forest Policy, and National Environment Policy of 2006, which have played a great role in bringing the forest back. And we got to learn a lot from these. An allied, but a rather very serious issue that we are facing today is the loss of floral and faunal species forever at a very, very alarming pace. As per the IUCN list, the data again is very, very serious and depressing and says in India especially, I'll just quote, it is 2.9% of the globally threatened floral species that we are having right now and 4.9% of the global threatened species of faunal varieties that we are having right now. This is definitely a point to ponder upon and look at how we are really playing with things and the parts of ecology that are really, really important for our well-being. So what needs to be done in the circumstances that we look at? We need to urgently address these issues of fragmented corridors, disrupted ecosystems, habitat loss, and desertification. And the solutions may come from the upcoming areas of research like ecological conservation, eco-restoration, rewilding, to make sure that we not only save these species from extinction, but also are able to restore some of them back to thrive in more rejuvenated and more healthier ecosystems. The glaciers are melting. The data about water resources and wetlands is equally depressing, as I talked about forests and wildlife. With 35% of the global wetland area lost since 1970, they are disappearing 3 times faster than forests, leaving more than a quarter of wetland species threatened with extinction. So chapter 12, which is saving vernacular urbanisms, I find is one of the most relevant and crucial to the contemporary urban discourse, because this chapter focuses on the significance of vernacular infrastructure, local knowledge, and indigenous wisdom specific to water that is vanishing from the contemporary urban situation in the name of modern and technological development. Because the pandemic has only aggravated the water crisis, it is even more urgent for designers and researchers to contemplate about and act on, as I said, ecology, sustainability, and habitat associations. These are the most crucial things that we need to turn up to and see what solutions do they have to offer us. In India, if I talk especially, this issue gets compounded because, of course, we know explosive demographic expansion and consequent gap between demand and supply. Although wetland conservation has been on our charts, but the data again is very bad, which says that the reports from MOEF, Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, and SAC, they say only 0.4% of wetlands are under conservation out of 55,862 wetlands, natural wetlands in India. So we have a long way to go. In Delhi, for example, this issue of water conservation has been central to making of the new master plan MPD, and we have laid enormous emphasis on strategies of water conservation and blue-green networks and infrastructure development to ensure that we are able to build a more sustainable and a more livable Delhi. So what I'm arriving at is the fact that a city can only be functionally sound and sustainable if the natural assets, resources, and processes are well understood, taken cognizance of urgently, and made an integral part of the development process. And this is the biggest message which I find the book also has to give us. Another facet that needs to be flagged here, and Vinayak has talked about it in his book, in the larger urban discussion, I find, is social urbanism, which ensures participation of all stakeholders, including the planners, designers, ecologists, decision makers, politicians, and city dwellers. We are expected to shoulder the responsibility of ensuring that there is a proper balance of landscape heterogeneity within our cities, and that designers are influenced by all sectors of community that are expected to be impacted by the development. This design process can be defined by weaving various linguistic, cultural, social, and environmental systems into place, realizing that there is no formula or one-size-fits-all solution for creating resilient and urban spaces. So a question which must become the basis of any planning or city project is whether the spaces we are designing today are really appropriate for the people or the users of the city, and further, are we counting in all the sections sections of the society in the real sense while taking spatial decisions, because people do matter. So the discourse on gender inclusive, child and elderly friendly cities designed for the marginalized, etc. are phrases, in my opinion, which in a way hint at the harsh reality of the inclusive planning sham that we claim to have achieved. We still have questions about it. The community participation in the planning process is a must to achieve the dream of inclusive and for all. Role of urban local bodies, I think, in a situation like India becomes very, very important and crucial in this regard. So I think I shall rest my comments here by stating the most crucial takeaways for the participants in the room Now that the pandemic has made us aware of the loopholes and systemic issues in our planning and developmental processes, I think it is high time that we implement a multidisciplinary approach where all stakeholders contribute and make a city that belongs to all and is inclusive in the truest sense. Living in this particular time of the Anthropocene offers also an opportunity to shift towards an interdependency mode and to consider other scales, agencies, systems, and complexities while taking special decisions. Only then, I'm sure, we can prepare adequately for a future which has a balanced distribution of urban, social, and environmental values. On the whole, I really think that the book successfully triggers almost all crucial and critical global examination of both our current urban realities and future possibilities, which may have a key role in rendering new meanings to urbanism, especially post-pandemic. But I assume that my comments would be appreciated by Vinayak and may even kindle thoughts of expanding at least a few chapters of the book into expanded formats in terms of research, or may lead to probably an advocacy project in future. Thank you for bringing 20 big ideas to the world of research on urbanism. Over to you, Vinayak.
I think it's over to you, Sangeeta.
Yes, sir.
Great. I think Vinayak began and gave us a great description and also the ideas of the book. And Aarti further enlarged that canvas and gave us more thoughts for enlarging and moving further on with the book. And I think there are students who are like, they have posted several comments. And I'm also happy to see Rohini Dhawan here. Hi, Rohini. So for this I'm grateful to Vinayak.
What's that?
I'm grateful to Vinayak because Vinayak has this, I think
He
he's
posted it on Facebook.
Yes, and Vinayak has this very interesting quality. He can connect several dots. Sitting
I would say
somewhere on the globe, he has this quality and he connects the dots. And I still remember in one of the urban design classes, Rohini had brought out this factor and she did one submission, which I'm reminded of, and she talked about the green cover in Chandigarh. And she talked about the Leisure Valley. I still remember this thing that she did. And we had a great conversation about how urban forestry could actually save cities. So the point that Aarti was also bringing in and about deforestation that Vinayak has very poignantly put it in his book, saying that one of the greatest disturbances that we cause to cities without realizing is by deforestation. And I think this is a lesson that we brought to class, I think a decade back when Rohini was a student at the CCA.
It's been more than 10 years. I think Professor Bharne has totally forgotten me also that I was at USC. So I'm like, completely surprising everyone here. But I saw his post that, he was presenting. So I think, I totally admire him and, both of you actually. So I was like, I'll just join and see. I was thinking maybe he's at the college. I just didn't know. I'm glad to be part of this conversation.
Right.
And you have a great memory, ma'am, as always. I think you bring out stories. I totally forgotten about that submission. I have no idea what you're talking about. But I think you always remember stuff.
So with this, I would like to bring in Sham for our little bit of discussion. And I think Sham's comments are extremely valuable. So Sham, over to you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Yes. Thank you, Vinayak. Thank you, Aarti, and thank you, Sangeeta. And of course, all the students who must be wondering what to do with all this information which we have got, which is so broad that what do we do with it? Because I was just wondering if I was a student at the master's program, and if I had been told, given all this information in one shot, I would be wondering what can I do with all this information? I'm not going to make a long speech or something, but I was trying to understand. It's a wonderful thing which Vinayak has done. I mean, we had discussed this some months back, so I knew this was coming. And in his inimitable way of putting thoughts down, he has put these thoughts down. And all these items he talks about, these have always been cracks in our professional, let's say, painting. They have been there and they have come forward. They have become larger cracks because of the COVID. So it's really, I mean, he has used the COVID recess to put them all together. But this is just one moment. I think the arguments he makes are as valid in future, etc. So in fact, COVID is just a moment because he had a little more time, I think. Maybe because of that, he put it together. I think one of the, I'm going to try to make 2 points actually, which are really very practical about, because I have, I'm not an academic. I've studied a lot, I've been to different courses and done architecture and urban design and planning with some landscape. And but I have a lot of professional practice, so I can talk about what this means actually to people who will go into the practice. I think as far as, if I go back to all the arguments which Vinayak makes, basically the basic argument to me is, and I'm trying to actually put it back into the forum from which in which Vinayak and we participate a lot, that is My Livable City, that we are trying to get an equitable, just society and a city and cities, which actually, so because health, public space, public transportation, landscape, everything finally leads to the fact that it has to be equitable and justice needs to be done, not only to those in power, but to everybody, and not only humans, but also other denizens of the planet and to the planet itself, basically. That would be my take on it. Now, if that is the case, then my question to the schools of architecture, and then I'm happy that people like Professor Arti Grover and Sangeeta Bagga are here, would be that when we teach at schools of architecture, I studied at IIT Kharagpur, but I graduated, 50 years back, 72 I graduated. So at that time, only in first year, I think we used to have a class which was called philosophy. Rest of the thing, we were talking about architecture and structural mechanics and everything else. I think if we have to inculcate in students the understanding of what just city or society is, I would say, can we in schools of architecture have more emphasis on ethics and issues, ethical issues about what our society is about and what we as experts, once we go into the field, the larger society in which we will be operating. So I would be a great exponent of introducing more of such programs and lectures in society, getting philosophers and sociologists to talk more about it, and particularly issues of ethics. Justice needs to be done, not only among humans, but also to flora and fauna, to the planet as such, because I think as humans, we are degrading everything terribly. And I mean, the figures are too depressing to even talk about. The other thing which I feel is that schools of architecture, and I think Professor Arti Grover will agree with me on this, I have said this earlier in the Society of Landscape Architecture yearly conference, where I was, I think, years back invited to talk. I have always said that I find it very strange that schools of Department of Landscape Architecture is a small department in schools of architecture. I think if the world would be much better if we had schools of landscape and environment as the basis, and then Department of Architecture just a small part of that. So all the students who did architecture first had a fundamental understanding of what environment is, what landscape is, and then they go on to ask themselves the question, what we can build in that, having understood what this planet is about. So I think these are two things which I think I would like to give, particularly from coming from an old man like me. I think I can talk to schools of architecture like this, that please do this. It will really help the new generation of students to come. Then going to the students, I can imagine that some of you might have thought, what do I do with all this information? Now, I can tell you one thing, that one of the basic things is, if you have learned some of these things in school, which I was just now discussing about, one of the main things is to keep asking questions. So when you are asked, I work in India, I'm working on a couple of large projects too. I work with too many architects who are just too concerned only in one particular line of thought. How do I deliver the floor space index, which I'm allowed to consume, as it is called, okay? So instead of that, if they were to ask more questions, so simply ask questions like, if I'm putting an air conditioner and it is belching out air, hot air into the public space, is this the right thing to do? I'm cooling the house, but I'm heating the public space. Am I doing the right? So ask those ethical questions which you need to ask. And we have been asking this in our projects in India with clients, and we have been able to discuss this with our clients, and we have been able to get them to change things. I can tell you names of projects of ours in Mumbai, Vadodara, Bangalore, which we do large projects, where we have clients who are really with us now. And some of them have also said to us that it's because of the general education which we got during the process, because of which things have happened. So I think as practicing architects, planners, landscape architects, whatever, first of all, don't think that your profession is the only holy one. Please collaborate with all other experts, which just now somebody, I think Professor Atiku, or you, I think Sangeeta, you made the point that is very important, because an expert who only thinks of his expertise often does more damage than else. I'll end with just one incident. I was sometime back in near Lonavala, out into the Ghats, and for a walk with some expert on biodiversity, and we were walking somewhere, and there on top of the hill in the evening, it was a wonderful place, and the biodiversity expert was telling us how the forest was so old, etc., etc. And the tallest hill, the forest had been cut, and a mast had been put for 4G or 5G. Okay. Now this engineer who put that mast as an expert probably got a promotion for having put it at the highest point, but he damaged something else which was far more valuable, which was outside his expertise. I think this is exactly what a lot of people are doing as experts. So please, when you go out into the profession, and this I'm addressing the students, please think of your expertise as only one little part of a larger society which you are trying to improve. Well, that's it. And thank you, Vinayak, for giving this opportunity.
Thank you, Sham. I think really you have hit the nail right there on the head. That this whole business of working in silos is something that we need to break for the students. And I want to share here that we are currently looking at 2 urban villages of Chandigarh as part of our design studio, which this set of students is looking at. And this, believe me, this lecture, this talk is really going to change their perspective. If not change, it's going to bombard them with a series of questions now. And over our personal class group for that subject, they're actually beginning to ask, and those questions are very poignant because their approach has to change, and they're actually dealing with one of the seasonal shows of Chandigarh in that. So at the moment, some of them were having their back to the seasonal rivulet. And I think it's very timely that the approach needs to be reconsidered, and they need to change their stance, whether the wetland can actually become a very important potential point for rejuvenating the village. So in some ways, I think, Vinayak, those little paragraphs that you've written, I'm sure they come from so much of experience, but they are the nuggets onto which I think the students are going to have to build upon the future of that studio that we are handling. So it's really good. And I can also see some more of our alumni here, and I can also see Bhavesh Mehta here. Bhavesh, are you there?
Yeah, ma'am. I'm here. I'm here. Thank you, ma'am.
Good morning.
I'm really
Bhavesh is
patiently. Yeah,
also
good
one of
morning.
our very important and very good resource for the CCA. And he has been following Vinayak, your work.
Yeah.
I
Recently,
think,
Vinayak sir, you were being the conference at Anand Sagar College. So you were the keynote speaker, where Nihal and Sanjeev also was there. So that time it was not very detailed presentation, but it was really today. We come to know about your book, so we are definitely going to have it in our library, and I think it's opening up a lot of new way of thinking in pandemic. So it's really interesting. And recently we visited Chandigarh also, so that's how it's quite relevant. That's why I was very keen to listen to your talk. Yeah. So thank you, ma'am.
thank you, Bhavesh. Meenal, I think we can go into the chat box now. There are questions and comments.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Now I would take up one question we have from Yogesh Makar. So he says, while focusing on health, we sometimes neglect the future of urbanism and vice versa. So, sir, what's your idea about dealing with and flourishing both simultaneously?
I think all of us should take these questions because they're very loaded. I've been reading them, so I may not be able to handle all of them. So Sham and Sangeeta, will you please help me here. And
Yes.
I'll start with this one, but please jump in on the rest. Aarti. So my wife is a health coach, Yogesh. So she has clients who she changes their life by sort of talking about health habits, and she's been doing this for many years now. And over many years of marriage, what I've learned through her is that health is an obsolete word. She tells me. I mean, I didn't know this. She says health has often been sort of defined conventionally as the absence of disease. That's how we define health. Oh, you're healthy, which means you're not diseased. But in her book, that's a very myopic way of thinking about health. Because in her book, health is a path to what she calls wellness. And wellness is when you've reached your highest potential in the sense of psychological health, mental health, how you feel, what you do, what you eat. So what she's always told me is that the more progressive way of thinking of health is not from a sort of the traditional biological perspective that I'm not diseased, so everything is good. It's about asking questions about long-term effects that your current habits are having on you. What kind of food are you eating? Is the food full of toxins that you don't know are having an effect on you? Is that going to have a long-term effect on your own health? So I guess, this has been ruminating in my mind in the context of urbanism and cities, which is, it's not about what we do today that's going to matter too much, or the short-term changes that we make about, all the things I spoke about. It's the bigger questions of, how can we generate long-term health in the city, long-term patterns and paradigms. And so I've often said that this whole talk about tactical urbanism, for example, is fantastic. I mean, I've mentioned so much of this in the book. But at the end of the day, I will also say that tactical urbanism is a band-aid, because it is only a means. It's like our cities are bleeding, and you can't stop them through long-term policy. You can't get these long waves. So what you're doing is you're using tactics to stop the blood, right? We want to help people, so we do something. It's a little tactical. It improves their lives. That's all good. But we can't make a big deal out of it, because that's not the end goal. The end goal is we have to simultaneously have long-term change as well. So I think the bottom idea, since you're asking, is what's your idea about dealing with and flourishing both simultaneously? I think the way I would say it is that it is a both and idea. And that's what the book essentially talks about. That this is not about pitting formal versus informal. It's not about informal economy versus the formal city. They're both concurrent realities. We need both of them. And that's how I think we should continue to work. So, there is no single answer to what planning and urbanism is today. I think the model of ideas that the book talks about are all about using health as a metaphor at the end of the day whether we call it inclusiveness, equity, equitability, whatever it is. But the fact is the methods of getting there are very different because cities are different, people are different, cultures are different. Isham may, on Sangeeta, Aarti may want to add to it, Rohini.
Can I jump in here and just continue what Vinayak has just started? And I would first, hello, Sham, and I think I have no other way but to agree with what Sham has started, which where he says that it is probably the mind frame that needs to be, hit it at this point of time. The way we have been in this whole way of looking at how cities should be, we have actually set in a prototype sort of a thinking at this point of time. We need to break those shackles. And I think it all lies or revolves around the acceptance of others, how other disciplines work, magnify the beauty of nature and culture around you, understand they have a lot to give. And instead of being exclusive and saying, this is my work, this is what I do, I think we need to move by finding commonalities. We should see what urban designers have to bring on the plate and what I as landscape architect bring, and how we move forward together and bring a change in the larger premise of designing and looking at cities as we do today. Not seeking to redefine a culture probably, but to rather embrace and express what others have to give. And now to the question which Yogesh has brought on the plate, I think it's a very valid question, and Vinayak has very appropriately answered it. My point to this would be that probably we look at the systems in a larger, in a larger picture, in a larger frame, and understand that each ecosystem or each entity has a carrying capacity. If we move beyond that, the results are going to be not so positive. So let's calculate before. So this sort of discussion will only be fruitful when we make sure that we are going in the right direction and we start from the right points. So landscape comes first, and we need to see how we can kind of put other smaller things in between, and carrying capacities are given due respect. How much can these ecosystems take is definitely calculatable.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. And I guess our next question from Hina Lakhani also seems answered, as she asked, are the smart city concept actually a boon or a bane to the city health? So this also seems answered. And next we have a question from Shardul Lohati from Masters first year. He says, as we can see, humanity is probably slowly back to nomadic life. Hence, taking inspiration from Tokyo, can we design an urban sprawl that can be consciously shattered and remade again?
It's a dangerous question. It's coming from a first year, I'm sure, right?
Master's first year, yes, sir.
Master's first year. It reminds me of my days when we used to all think polemically in college. Anyway, I want to remind you, Shardul, that you don't want to live in a city like Tokyo. I mean, Tokyo, the idea of being shattered and rebuilding again is an extremely painful process. I mean, it's not a joke. I don't know if you know, but when World War II got finished, more than 50% of Tokyo had been razed to the ground. Sham can talk about Rotterdam after I'm done, because it has gone through a similar thing. But I'll talk briefly about Tokyo. Every time Tokyo has been destroyed, what they've had to do is relax the regulations. Relax the regulations, because the more stringent you make regulations, the slower your city, the more difficult it is to get your city built. So, once you relax your regulations, a lot of unpredictable things begin to happen. So agrarian lots, for example, small little lots, 10 feet wide, got extruded with buildings 6 stories, 7 stories tall. And the result is aspects of urban design and city making that the Western world would consider grotesque. But what works in Tokyo? I think this is the most important question that we have to learn. I don't know about humanity returning back to a nomadic lifestyle. I don't know about that. I've never heard about it. But your second question is taking inspiration from Tokyo. Can we design an urban sprawl? I don't know what that means either. But I'll tell you what inspires me about Tokyo. That's the question I will answer. What inspires me about Tokyo is 4 or 5 things that we all can learn from. The first one is that it is a polycentric, transit-oriented city. This is a lesson every city can learn. So the way Tokyo works fundamentally is that Tokyo is a huge metropolitan region with about 30 million people. If you look at the metropolitan area of Tokyo, is about 30 million. That's enormously huge, denser than Bombay, denser than all these cities. And it has a series of hubs, all of which have massive train stations and massive train lines connecting the city from one place to the other. And then there is a contorted sort of, because Tokyo is hilly, a contorted grid of roads and streets that makes no sense from a design standpoint. But if you want to get from one place to the other, you take the trains and you arrive at these transit nodes. And all of the urbanism, the sort of cool urbanism, the design urbanism, happens in these districts. So you have heard of Ginza, you have heard of Shinjuku, Shibuya. These are all highly designed, these neon districts, right? Why are they so incredibly designed? Because that's where all the major activity happens. And the rest of Tokyo is just a city where a lot of social housing and dense housing just keeps happening. That's number one. So transit becomes the structure of the entire city. That's point number one that I found very inspiring. I mean, if our cities could be centered around transit, not cars, that's brilliant. Second, there is mix of uses everywhere. This is one of the biggest lessons of Tokyo. Zoning in America is what we call Euclidean, which means that in a residential zone, you cannot have commercial uses. You have to sit in a freeway and then go to a retail store. In Japan, zoning has, there are 12 zones, but the zones don't tell you what uses to not put. It basically says, if you're in a residential zone, you can put as many uses as you want in that residential zone. The only use you cannot put is a toxic industrial use. That you cannot put. So the code is inclusive, not exclusive. The code says you want to put a coffee shop, put it in the corner. So the result is anywhere you go in Tokyo, you will find a little snack shop, you will find a little drink shop, and the noodle shop, a ramen shop. And this is an incredible way of living in a city because you find ways, your needs are everywhere. And this fosters pedestrianism. This fosters all kinds of amazing things. That's what inspires me about Tokyo. There are 10 things I can tell you that don't inspire me about Tokyo, but that's not your question. So I'll leave it at that and keep you happy. But I would love for Sham to comment on Rotterdam because he has a lot of points that he shared with me.
I think the question was about urban nomadic lifestyle and urban sprawl. How can we make I think that word itself, urban sprawl, suggests something which I cringe at, because it suggests as if something has gone out of control and has sort of has gone out into the landscape. I personally feel, and I have been in Rotterdam was destroyed during the Second World War. The whole center of Rotterdam was destroyed. Only I think 3 major buildings were left, and it was rebuilt, and it took decades to rebuild it, and I don't think they would like it to be redestroyed and rebuilt every now and then. So I think indeed that that would probably happen in a computer gaming session can be done more easily, but in real life that's going to be difficult. I want to come back on this urban sprawl thing. I personally feel, and in fact Vinayak and myself, we have written a book recently about it, about redeveloping cities. So it is about trying to contest the idea itself that so many urban sprawls happen, actually suggesting that there are so many parts of the cities which are underutilized and not working well enough that we should be continuing to recycle those parts and reusing them instead of letting the cities take elements from the landscape and the environment around it. Even in India, where the cities are growing at an alarming rate, I'm personally involved with 3 large projects which are related to redeveloping old areas of the city and redensifying them and actually bringing them to much higher density with a lot of landscape too at the same time, to tell you the truth. So if it is possible, and I think that should more be the way than actually going for urban sprawl. I hope I've answered some question. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Next question we have is from Professor Architect Rajkumar Nayak. He says, What could be the structure of future cities in wake of changing occupational work patterns and lifestyle? What impact would the field of metaverse bring to future cities?
Meenal, I'm sorry, I'm intervening in between. Professor Bagga, Shamji, and Vinayak, please, you'll have to excuse me. I'll have to go urgently for a meeting right now. Would you mind if I leave the meeting now?
No worries. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aarti.
Thank you for your
So
valuable
nice to be here. Thank you for
Thank
making
you.
me a part of this. Thank you so much.
Sham, can you help me and take this question first?
Can you repeat that question once again? Something about.
Yeah, I'll just repeat. What could be the structure of future cities in wake of the changing occupational or work patterns and lifestyle? So, what impact would the field of metaverse bring to future cities?
To tell you the truth, I don't think, if you look back, I think for decades and for centuries, urban patterns have been able to, if urban design and cities have been designed in a proper way, we have been able to accommodate any technological change in it. I don't see personally, because next to what technology does, there is always the human side of it, that people would still like to meet each other, in spite of the fact that we will be doing more things online, etc. So I don't see directly a reason now. We might have the possibility of working with people in a totally different cities, like we are doing just now in certain particular forums. But otherwise, I don't see why the urban structure totally needs to take such things into account. I think it will be flexible enough to take things the way they come. And this metaverse is a new thing which is now being bandied about a lot. And I'm not certain whether we need to worry about it just now, to tell you the truth. Vinayak?
Well, I'll say a couple of sort of random points in this. So, the book talks about this in two ways. The book actually implicitly challenges the sort of overdoing of the metaverse concept, because the idea of festivals, for example, I mean, to Sham's point, you may be able to read the New York Times or the Times of India on a computer, but we still love to hold newspapers in our hands. I mean, that's not going to go away. I think the fact that festivals showed so much resilience, the fact that they were performed, the fact that they continue to be performed, I mean, these are important blueprints that are never going away. So that's very important. Okay? And it might be different in the Western world a little bit, but even there, I think we were all craving, in a way, the idea of coming out of our little cocoons. That's one. The second thing is on the structure part. I think the way I would say it is a polycentric city. That was the essay that critiqued the metaverse, which is, on the one hand, we think about it, retail sales went immediately digital, at least in the US, at least during the early 2020s, because we didn't want to step out of our houses when we didn't know too much about the virus. So we all started ordering online. The shops were even happy to oblige. You would get into your car, you would go around there, you would stop in the parking lot, and they would bring you your stuff. Now, the danger here is this could exacerbate the same debacle that happened in the 1920s, where everybody began to rely on cars. So what is the answer? You sit in your car and you go to the grocery store and they come and give you your stuff, or you order everything off the internet. This happened during the early 2020s, but if you follow the retail trends, something magical happened in the end. We all wanted to come out. And as we all wanted to come out, because we were fed up of being siloed in the metaverse, shops began to respond in another way. Cities got inside out. They took the parking that was on streets, at least in the US, they took all the parallel parking that was on the side of the streets, and they created these parklets. And that's where you would hang out in the open air, and that's where you would eat. So socialization came back. In Manhattan, I talk about this in my book, in the 1960s, Sham and I talk about this, there was a policy called POPs, privately owned public spaces, where, because Manhattan was so dense, they passed a rule as early as the 60s, where if if you built your building with a kind of a plaza or an open space at the base of it, you would get extra FAR and density. So they were creating these little spaces, but all these tiny spaces came with a lot of restrictions. You could only use this, you could only sit this way. During the lockdowns, they laxed all these restrictions. So what happened is all of a sudden, Manhattan became a lot more meaningful because all these open spaces, private and public, became available for people. So my main point to Sham's point is, I agree with Sham on this. I think the metaverse has enabled us to do a lot of things during this time. It's enabled us to conduct our business, talk about things, etc., and keep life so-called normal. But there is no question over the last 2 years that we have been craving sort of the usual idea of the spontaneous crowd. And cities have responded brilliantly to making this happen, even though the pandemic hasn't really gone away. So the metaverse is not going to go, but I'll tell you where the metaverse works. And that's the sort of final sort of point of my answer to your question. The metaverse has changed the concept of public and private. That much I will admit. Because think about it, this is a public forum. Sham and I are speaking in public. But what if I told you that I was sitting in my jammies here? You wouldn't know that. You would think I'm dressed up, and so I could be sitting in a public plaza, but I could be digitally talking to an entire world, but I'm being private in a certain way, public in a certain way, which was not possible before the metaverse came through. So a lot of patterns have changed. But I think Sham is absolutely right. I have the same observation that cities are not going to change as much. Perhaps structurally, they are going to find other ways of bringing social spaces closer to dwelling spaces. It'll make our cities more and more polycentric to begin with.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. So next question we have is from Anjali Tiwari from Master's first year. She says, urbanization is a key to India's future. This is a statement from report by NITI Reforms in Urban Planning Capacity in India. So what should be the extent or how much urbanization so that the history heritage also remains intact as well as it stands out as urbanized city or a country?
Sham, go ahead, please.
Can I try? I see actually no contradiction in. The question seems to suggest a contradiction, as if heritage will have to be destroyed to get the country urbanized. I see really no contradiction in it. In fact, a lot of old structures and buildings, like we just now talked about, the fact that cities structures can be very resilient, and also buildings can be. They can be reused in different ways. I'll give you an example. Just now, the project within the Indian context, something which has really worked well and is working well. You can look this up. This is called the Alembic City in Vadodara. It's an old industrial site. The client had been working on it for the last 7 years to rejuvenate and reuse that site, industrial site, as a mixed use, housing, work, etc., etc. But we started by taking the oldest building, which is a 110-year-old building, which is totally dilapidated. We converted it into a museum. We have created a courtyard around it and used some of the oldest buildings, about 100-year-old buildings, redone parts of it. And it has become the cultural hub of Vadodara now. It is the place to be. And everything around it is now, some of you might have heard of it. So there is no contradiction between the two. And in fact, I think heritage and culture can really be used to energize a place. And I think we should, and we must. That's it. I see no contradiction here.
Yes, thank you, sir. So Anjali also adds up, should transformation be one of the aspects of urbanization, especially for the cities like Banaras, which is old heritage city? So this seems answered, Anjali. Right. So next question we have from Bhavna. So she says, so right, Sham sir, this question has been troubling me since long. Is it fine to cool our own space through ACs and throwing hot air outside world? So this question she's posed is to Sham sir. So please throw some light, sir, on this. The thermal
Meenal, she has not posed the question. She's expressed her happiness that Sham has actually brought this on the table.
Yes.
Thanking.
Thanks.
Yes, it's a very troubling question to us all the time, that it becomes like a situation of have and have nots.
Yes.
So it's for us as architects who are responsible for a social dimension in the society also. So the inclusivity of the society comes from changing our decisions to one that affects, or the beneficiaries of that are the masses rather than being the elitist. We should look for a more democratic way of living. And that's where the whole idea of inclusiveness and inclusivity comes into the picture. Which brings me to Shardul's question. He says, Le Corbusier thought a city should be decentralized entity. But Cliff Morton and a few others say that a centralized city works better. So can we throw some light on this perspective? And I think he's asking Vinayak again because of the idea of Tokyo and its polycentric nature. So I think Vinayak, this is directly for you.
Yeah, well, others can answer it too. First of all, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I would agree with you that Le Corbusier thought the city should be a decentralized city. I would not agree with you on that one at all, but that's okay. The main point is there is no one answer to cities, right? I mean, this is the reason the book gets wanders like aimlessly all over the world, because you cannot look at cities from any singular perspective. That is the biggest mistake we make. I mean, the whole idea of the pedestrian shed being the only sort of sole torchbearer to making a neighborhood is a wrong idea. There are many other ways of thinking of a neighborhood. So this is what the book is talking about, that urbanism is complex and contradictory. And we have to embrace all of these. If you're working in India, you have to embrace realities of its culture, which are one. Now, talking about Corbusier and Chandigarh, one of the big lessons of Chandigarh is that it has gone far beyond Corbusier. This is the great lesson of Chandigarh. For me, Corbusier did something for his time. And we can get into the whole history of it. He tried something, he did something. Perhaps it was a success in some ways, a failure in others. That's not the point. But I have always maintained that what Chandigarh is today has nothing to do with Corbusier. Absolutely nothing. Chandigarh is a mature city today because the people have done something to it that is their own. They've taken over the sectors. They've taken over the central piece. Even the capital has changed its guise. This is not Corbusier. So one of the things I'm saying basically here is, cities are not static entities. They cannot be thought of to original intentions. Corbusier thought it was decentralized. Somebody said it was centralized. What is correct? Neither of it is correct. Maybe both are correct. At the end of the day, for me, as the book sort of argues, urbanism is about trying something, okay, without making a claim that it's going to make things better or worse or anything. It's about trying. We all try our best. Corbusier, if he tried his best, that's great. Whether it failed or succeeded is for us to learn from. 60 years have passed. Of course, you'll learn from it. I think this is the wonderful thing about it. And the theme the book really picks up on, and Sham can elaborate on this, is, a lot of people contradicted the traditional city. They polemicized urbanism through architecture. The streets were thrown away. Corbusier called the street a narrow cleft. He never liked streets. I mean, you read his work. So that's not the point. He was a great person. So the point is they were trying to make different models of cities. The main point is what has endured through all these experiments is that the qualities of pre-industrial urbanism still hold true. I mean, you go to Amsterdam, you walk along the canals, okay? I don't think anybody in this world would not like these places. So I've often asked myself, why is it that when we go to these places, why is it then we go to Jaisalmer? Forget Amsterdam, go to Jaisalmer, why is it when we experience these places, these streets, these chalks, these life that's going on there, what is it about these places that is so enduring that after centuries, they're still teeming and they're still beautiful? I think those are lessons that we can probably say have a much greater resilience than many of these models. So only point I'm trying to make is all models have something to teach us. There is never going to be a perfect answer to whether a centralized or a decentralized model is. Now, in the context of Tokyo, it works because Tokyo doesn't have a choice. Tokyo is so dense, it has less land, and therefore, what are you going to do? Los Angeles, where I live, is the antithesis of Tokyo. Los Angeles is so big, so vast, as you know, it's a vast city. And the reason it grew so vast is because it had freeways. And that's the only reason it grew. But the problem in living in Los Angeles is if I want to go to another city, it takes me 3 hours because there's no public transit. So polycentrism in Tokyo works because it's a dense city, a lot of pedestrian activity. It has no choice but to be a model that is now beginning to teach the world that there's another way of behaving in cities every day, which is not to rely on the car. That's all I will say on the polycentric side. But Sham, lessons from the Netherlands would be very useful here, I think.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing, that the question again seems to suggest as if, like Vinayak says, as if there's a one particular model, which is not the case. And I think I personally believe in the fact that the main determinant of any city and its success is the landscape and the climate where it is built. So that is the first thing from which we'll need to learn and build. And even in spite of all new technology and air conditioning, because we can't afford air conditioning for everybody, and we don't want to do it because it's not sustainable model to have. So the way the cities have to be built will be based on the ground on which it is built and the climate where it is built, and the landscape of the place. So you never get a flat piece of land where you can just about do anything. The history of that land tells you what to do. At the edge of Pune, where I was involved with a particular project, which unfortunately did not happen, it was a slightly hilly, undulating area. And you could see actually over the centuries when the rain had fallen, where the rain would go. And along those places, trees had grown because they remained wet much longer. So they gave actually the spaces where we could create new public spaces. So what I'm trying to say is, and the climate, that will create the culture of the place in the long term. Because if the place is a pleasant climate and if you have landscaped it well, people are going to use the public spaces. So there is no one singular model of doing things. In Netherlands, we have learned to live with water. Everything is based on water because we have to, at least around 10% of the land area is used for water, because otherwise we will be inundated by it. So we have to deal with these physical realities. And that gives the model which works best in that specific place. Okay.
Let me just answer his second question about Tokyo, because I know I can see that you're curious about what's not great about Tokyo. Let me give you one example, okay? Because Tokyo is so dense, I don't know if you know this, but around anywhere between 15 to 30% of Tokyo changes every year. You think of what that means. So because there's so much land scarcity and so much pressure, the only way Tokyo sustains its built economy is you demolish buildings and you build them again, and you demolish buildings and you build them again. So if you think about it, all the great buildings designed by architects in Tokyo are gone. Frank Lloyd Wright's Imperial Hotel, gone. Nakashin Capsule Tower, as you know, is right in the middle of a huge upheaval right now. Why is this happening? Because land is a very precious commodity. And the only way to sustain the economy is to demolish and build again. This is a very unsustainable practice. Building, scrapping, and building again is a problem. So there are a lot of questions that you can ask about Tokyo, which is why we call it a kind of an extreme urbanism. So it is not the city that is a model for other cities. And there are other things we could tell you too. But just saying that, it's like looking at an albino animal. It's like Just because the animal looks different doesn't mean you call it an oddity. It's not an oddity. It's just another reality. You go there and you learn lessons, and then you come and you learn another lesson, and you go to another city and you learn another lesson. So Chandigarh has a lot to teach us. So does Tokyo. So does Amsterdam.
Thank you, sir. So now we'll take up one more question. That is from Ritika from Masters. So she says, like you were discussing about spiritual aspect is sensitive issue for communities, and that is leading to the cutting down of the trees and degradation of environment. So can you throw light on how can we deal with this issue? Because similar we are observing this in our urban villages.
Well, I want Shyam to start with this because in one of the projects he did, he actually, he saves trees beautifully in his work. So I'll address this a little bit, but I would like for him to talk first.
Minal, I didn't get the question correctly, actually.
Sir, like we are discussing, that spiritual aspect is a sensitive issue for communities, and yet this is leading to the degradation of environment, like sir discussed in the book. So can you throw light, how can we save this issue?
I think the example which Vinayak gives is basically that under a tree, the temple and the ceremony start, and at the end the tree might go or will go, okay, or can go. I personally, I'll go back to the tree thing. All the projects I work on, all the people in the team know that for every single tree which they have to cut, they have to come back to me for permission. So we have built roads also in Vadodara and in Bangalore and in Mumbai, where the roads go all over the place, but the trees are saved. Okay, so and we have been able to convince the clients that will create a campus or a part of a city which will be much more livable, and at the end create real estate value. That is important to tell your clients who are commercial developers. Okay, so this is all which I'll say just now. And the religious bit and the combination with landscape, I'll leave it to Vinayak.
Well, so there are two aspects to this. There's, I think it was, what's his name? The Canadian-Japanese environmentalist, I think Suzuki, I think his name is a beautiful saying. He says, if you think of a mountain as nothing but a heap of ore, that's one thing. But if you see the mountain as an abode of the god, then it immediately changes your perspective of how to behave with it. If you think of a river as water to be commodified, it's one thing, but if you think of the river as a living thing, it's a different thing. So that's one. So what intrigued me about the idea is that for, at least in India, we've had this beautiful tradition where trees have been revered. And if you dig into the histories of why they were revered, it was not because of some mythic belief that there was a god in it or anything like that. Of course, that might have been. But they, certain trees like banyan trees, peepal trees, they are worshipped more because of scientific reasons. It's the amount of oxygen they generate. There's a lot of stuff that is just simply empirical. That's what's beautiful about it. But the fact is, psychologically, you can revere something as beautiful as a tree. So that's one. And that becomes a kind of what intrigued me is that it protects the tree. It becomes such an important aspect of resilience that nobody has the courage to cut down that tree. I've seen this all over India. You've seen this all over India. Even a street tree, you will not have the courage. In Mumbai, I believe it was in the late 80s, they went on a citywide campaign to erase all these wayside shrines. And they destroyed all these wayside shrines. And it was against the will of the commoners. But you know what happened? The shrines went away, but the spots still remained important. And again, the next day you would see a little tilak coming there and a little shrine put under it, and then the process began again. So these things are not going away. That's one. That's why I'm saying, if these things are not going away, why are we not noticing them? Why is planning not noticing them? Because they're not going away. They have such a huge impact on our cities. Why are we not noticing them? That's one. But the second point is the one Shyam is making, which I think is very important, which is that's not the way mundane urbanism works. If you talk to a conventional developer, and there's a beautiful tree on the side, that developer is not going to tell you, I want to keep that tree. He's going to say, take the tree out, we'll plant 5 more trees and give me my FAR. So that's where the other point comes in. And this is not related to trees only. It's related to agricultural land. It's related to forests. It's related to wetlands. How do we bring value into these entities to make them profitable entities? I mean, there has to be an incentive for developers. So if there's a tree, if there's a wetland, if there's a forest, if urban designers can design their projects in such a way that you tell them, you know what, I'm making a green space where your tree is going to be the centerpiece. And that's going to be the most beautiful thing about it. That's where urban design becomes so wonderful. And Shyam has done this. That's why I'm telling you. It's like that is the power of good design. Because you now say, you thought it was a constraint, but I'm telling you, it's actually the most beautiful centerpiece of your project. And as a result, your project will appear as if it was 10 years old from the first day it is opened because you have matured trees in it. And it goes on and on. So if you can spin the equation, spin the constraint in a way that now becomes something fantastic for the project from an economic perspective, I think that's the genius of urban design. It can make this happen.
This is a great point, Vinayak, that you made. And in fact, when the students bring us the studies on paper, we always ask them, they just recently made models of the 2 villages that they're working. So we almost had a big fight to ask them to put in all the trees, to put in all the contours, to map it, and to actually show us the slope and the lay of land. And it was such an engagement with them. And believe me, the whole studio has taken a different shape because now they understand the ecology. They understand the value of what the site has as its inherent potential. And not just something that it's a piece of paper onto which some kind of a planning exercise is to be done. And as you said, it has raised the value of the project. So the value of the project actually comes from what is inherent in the site. And that's what we try and keep telling them and taking them back to the village to say that try to read the city. And today's conversation is really going to change, further enhance the way the studio is going to run. So it's really timely. That's what I can say. Thanks.
Thank you.
It was indeed a knowledgeable and fruitful session, which has left us all with various thoughts to ponder upon. I would really like to thank you, Vinayak sir, for taking out time and enlightening us. So now I would request Sangeeta ma'am to share her few words and conclude today's lecture.
Well, I have all my thanks here to Vinayak. We've been trying to do this talk for many months now. And his book is also soon going to be part of our library, which is thanks to Shyam and Vinayak. I'm grateful for that. And the perspective which this book has brought in today's, particularly in this subject that we teach and the studio, it's got a very different perspective now, and the dimensions of thinking are actually going to change. Because though written from the perspective of the pandemic, it has actually rejuvenated the way the studio should be carried out. And Vinayak, if it would be possible, we would really like to bring you into the studio also sometime in the near future. And if Shyam also agrees, I think it'll be great to have one of the studio sessions with you in the future while they work on these villages, if you have the time and if we can make, because it's already midnight for you, I think, Shyam, Vinayak.
For me, it's
midnight.
No, it's fine. I can stay awake for one night, Sangeeta. But before we say good night, I would like Shyam to have the final word.
Yes,
particularly as a person who made this book possible.
Absolutely.
No, I have very little to add except to say that Vinayak has put thoughts on paper which are very also close to my heart, and he has a fantastic way. He's a very talented thinker, but I think more important, also a very talented writer. So he combines those two things and is a great asset to our profession. And I hope you all profit from him in years to come. from all the knowledge he has to disseminate. And all the best, Sangeeta, and all the students and everybody else watching. And Vinayak, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sham. It was delightful having you with us today and
Thank
sharing
you
your
for
thoughts with the students.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So on behalf of Chandigarh College of Architecture, I would really like to thank you, Vinayak sir, for taking out time and enlightening us with this interactive session on your book, Urbanism Beyond 2020. I would also like to thank you, Principal Ma'am, Dr. Sangeeta Bagga, for curating such lecture for all of us. I would like to extend my thanks to faculty for their support. Thank you to one and all for your patience and for being a kind audience. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.